All righty. Welcome everyone to the final class of this fantastic 5-session class on Jewish life in Eastern Europe. It's really been a treat, I think, for all of us to have the opportunity to learn from Professor Sam Kassow, and these 5 or 6 weeks of the actual class have flown by, and each as each hour and a half of class has flown by as well. So we're all very excited to have our final session tonight on Jewish Lodz, as Sam calls it, the Chicago of Eastern Europe, which I'm sure he'll explain in class tonight. So we're going to have our same format as we've had in previous sessions. That is that we will go from now. Sam will teach until approximately 8:30. And then we'll take a short break around 8:30 to get up, stretch our legs, grab a drink of water, whatever. And then we'll come back and we'll have time for Q&A. And please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to type in questions as you have them. And then Sam will try to answer as many of the questions as he can at the end of class. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Professor Sam Kassow. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, and welcome to our last class. And tonight we're talking about Lodz, although Lodz was a tri-national city until World War II. So the Poles pronounced it Łódź, and the Germans pronounced it Lodz. And there was a word that was used in both Yiddish and German called a Ludgermensch. And a Ludgermensch was kind of a Lodz guy, the kind of guy, if you read my New Republic article, who would make and lose fortunes, who would watch his factory burn down and collect not one, but double insurance and that kind of thing. Lodz had a reputation as being a very brash, very entrepreneurial, very everything goes kind of a city. The great Yiddish writer Shalom Aleichem said, "In Lodz is alles möglich, everything goes." Cities grew so rapidly. In 1820, there were only a couple hundred Jews in Lodz. By 1860, there were a couple thousand. By 1914, the Jewish population of Lodz reached 200,000. The city as a whole grew from a mere 1,000 people in 1820 to 500,000 by 1914. And what made this happen was a combination of a number of things: the textile industry and brilliant entrepreneurs, almost entirely German and Jewish, and the building of the railroads. All those pieces had to come together to make Lodz work. And these entrepreneurs were larger than life characters. The two biggest in Lodz were the German Karl Wilhelm Scheibler and his Jewish competitor and frenemy, the great renowned Israel Poznansky, who was born in 1833 and died in 1900. And here you have one of the many pictures of Poznansky. Here's an early etching of his famous factory when the factory was at its height. Poznansky started off as an agent of the Scheiblers, and he began to go into business on his own in 1872. And this was a good time to go into the textile business because the railroads were getting built, and I'm about to talk about that soon. But Poznansky was able to find a niche, and that niche was to buy cheaper cotton. And he bought that cotton not from the American South, but from Turkmenistan, from Russian Central Asia. It was inferior cotton, but he understood retailing, merchandising, but also the manufacture and the chemistry of manufacturing clothes and cloth and materials so that even if it was of a cheaper fabric, it would look good. And this became one of the keys to Poznański conquering the mass market. Poznański did not make upscale stuff, but he made the kind of stuff that you would be able to buy once upon a time in Bradley's or J.C. Penney's. And Poznański was a master of vertical integration. That is, he bought his own power plants. He bought his own chemical plants. He did not take the factory public for a very long time. He kept it a family affair, and like Jeffrey Bezos, who built up Amazon, Poznański kept plowing profits back into the business. And he also became a major partner in one of Warsaw's largest banks. So Poznański had a steady supply of capital and credit. He built his own electrical stations. And he hired thousands of workers and built workers' housing right next to the factory. And the workers' housing, by the standards of the 1870s and 1880s, was not bad. It was a step above what workers would have been used to in Lodz. But the point was that helped Poznański discipline the workers. If they got fired, they also lost their apartment. Poznański set up food stores for the workers to buy food. It was kind of like a West Virginia company town. And he kept tight discipline on his labor force. Poznański did not hire Jewish workers. He hired only Poles because the Poles were more docile. They were peasants coming in from nearby villages, and they worked for less than the Jewish workers. The Jewish workers needed to make more because they needed to send their kids to Cheder. They needed to make Shabbos. They needed to buy kosher meat. And when somebody once asked, why didn't Poznański hire Jewish workers? Poznański replied, I want 6,000 workers. I don't want 6,000 business partners. If he hired Jews, he'd be afraid the workers would invite him to their son's bar mitzvahs. They would invite him to the bris. They would think that he was a shtickle mechutin. And as Poznański began to make big money, he built an amazing palace. And the first thing he wanted to do was to build a better palace than his German rival Scheibler. This was Scheibler's palace. This is a little memorial in Lodz today. There are little memorials all over the city because Lodz today is like Poland's Waterbury. You know, it's an industrial town that's seen better days. So the city is really trying to up its game and get tourists. So they're putting these little memorials all over the city. And here's a memorial on the Ulica Piotrkowska, and here's Scheibler, and here's Poznański. And they're sitting down and having a chat. So Poznański decided to build a palace that was bigger than Scheibler's. And then he said, hey, why not also build a palace for my son or my daughter? So he built not one, but 3 major palaces. And there's a legend that the architect said, well, do you like Baroque? Do you like classical? Do you like Art Nouveau? And Poznański was supposed to have thought a minute and said, I'll take all 3. These palaces still stand today. During World War II, the Germans used the Poznański Palace as Gestapo headquarters. So here are some pictures from the interior of the palace. Now, while Poznański hired only Polish workers, he and the other big Jewish tycoons the Silbersteins, the Kopstats, built the infrastructure of the Jewish community. Poznański built the beautiful progressive synagogue on Kosciuszko Street. He built the Jewish hospital, which became one of the finest Jewish hospitals in all of Europe, along with the Jewish hospital in Warsaw that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. Poznański was a patron of Jewish artists like Samuel Hirschenberg, who played a very major role in Jewish art in Eastern Europe, and Hirschenberg designed part of the palace interior. Poznański bought the land for the very big Lodz Jewish cemetery in Marysium, and he financed the Talmud Torah. And there's a story that Poznański met the great Jewish philanthropist, Baron de Hirsch, who spent millions and millions of dollars resettling Jews on the pampas of Argentina. And Baron de Hirsch asked Poznański, how many workers are in your factory? And he said 6,000. And Baron de Hirsch said, how many Jews? Maybe 10, maybe 15 white collar jobs. So what have you done for the Jews? Well, I built a wonderful hospital. And Baron de Hirsch is said to have replied, you know, it would be better if you did the opposite, if you hired 6,000 Jewish workers and built a hospital for the Poles. There's also a story that just before he died, Poznański met Theodor Herzl and was planning a major contribution to the Zionist movement. But apparently he died before he was able to do so. Excuse me, Avi, can you show the picture of the Poznański tomb?
Yes.
Even in death.
It's just gonna stop your share if I do that, okay? Okay.
Oh, okay.
Do you want me to still do that? Yeah.
So then how would I get back to mine?
You'll just have to then reshare this file when you're ready.
Okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna,
Yeah.
all right, I'm gonna share the picture of the tomb.
This is a picture that my wife Lisa took in Łódź. This is a very big tomb, and it is bigger than the tombs of the Kopstats or the Silbersteins. And this, of course, befits the splendor of the Poznański family. Okay, I'm going to go back now to my own screen share. Let me. Okay. After Poznański died, he dies in 1900. His son, Maurycy, this is a picture of the synagogue, of the hospital. So after he dies, his son, Maurycy Poznański, marries the daughter of the second richest Jew in Łódź, Sarah Silverstein. And this is Sarah Silverstein. And this was called the royal wedding. And everybody who was anybody in Łódź, the Germans, the Russian bureaucrats, the Polish noblemen, everybody came to this wedding. This was an amazing splash. And Sarah and Maurycy decided that it was time for Łódź to up its game. Łódź was simply known as a grim factory town, and they then splurged to establish an opera house, to fund a theater, and to try to make Łódź into a major cultural center as well as an economic center. Now, what made all this possible was the railroad boom. There were two Jews, both of whom converted to Christianity, Leopold Kronenberg and Jan Bogomil Bloch. And here's a picture of Jan bloc, and they controlled major banks and plowed that capital into building the railroads in Poland, especially in the 1860s and 1870s. Now, keep in mind, from a lecture that I gave earlier, you'll remember that Warsaw was the place where the European gauge railroads met the Russian gauge railroads. The Russian railroads were much wider than the European rail. And as the railroads were being built, there were key railroads. Here you see, by the way, some of the engineering feats that Jan Bloch was able to establish. This is the Iron Lattice Bridge over the Bug River, the railroad that's now going to connect Warsaw to the Russian interior. This is another bridge. You might say that the railroad stations quickly become the cathedrals of the 19th century, and the bridges become the major architectural wonders. And Jan Bloch builds a railroad from Lodz that links up to the major Warsaw-Moscow Railroad. And then, as you can see here, the Russians are building the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which goes all the way into China. And that's the game changer, because you take those railroads, you add the fact that the Russians abolished their internal tariff with Congress Poland, which they controlled, and you add the fact that the Russians greatly devalued the ruble, making imports into Russia much more expensive. And what do you get? You get a vast Russian market that's opening up, and with the Trans-Siberian Railroad, that market is expanding into Asia. And so people like Poznański and Silverstein and the German entrepreneurs are going to town, and they are competing with the big Moscow textile merchants, but they're competing very, very well. Now, how do they sell? How do they get into these markets? If you've read Sholem Aleichem, or if you know anything about Yiddish literature, one of the real comic staples of Sholem Aleichem's so-called Eisenbahngeschichtes, railroad stories, was the Commis Voyageur. Now, the Commis Voyageur was a Lodz type. It was in a Lodz, the Commis Voyageurs were called the Lords. Now, who was a Commis Voyageur? He would leave his wife and kids in Lodz right after Sukkot, and he would then be gone for about 10 months. And he would go into the Russian interior. He would go into Samara, Chelyabinsk, Omsk, Novosibirsk, Tomsk, and he would wine and dine the major merchants and storekeepers in these towns. And even though these towns were not in the pale of settlement, according to Russian law, Jews who had a certain amount of money could leave the pale and live in these cities. So many of the major stores in these rapidly growing Siberian cities were in Jewish hands. So what did the Commis Voyageur do? He would seduce women. If a woman was the proprietor of an important store, he would go into shul and give liberal contributions for the Jewish charities. He would daven at the Amud and charm everybody with his wonderful voice. He would flash money right and left and do what had to be done to land deals and get orders. And then in late August, just before the high holidays began, he would come back to Lodz with presents for his wife and kids and a whole order book for the Lodz factories to fill. So as the wealth of the city grew, of course, the Jewish community also needed respected leadership, not just the entrepreneurs, but also respected rabbis who could enforce rules on the community and give the community a sense that there was somebody who could provide a role model for proper behavior. And again, Lodz was lucky in that they found a rabbi, Eliyahu Chaim Meisels, who was a Litvak. He came from Horodok, but he settled in Lodz and was the chief rabbi of Lodz for many decades until he died in 1912. And when he died, his funeral was enormous. You see, this is a picture of the funeral. There must have been 70 to 100,000 people at the funeral of Rabbi Meisels. And what made Meisels such an interesting character is that he spoke good Russian, so he was able to hobnob with the Russian officials, and he kind of kept them mildly disposed towards the Jewish population. He commanded the respect of the Gvirim, that is, he commanded the respect of the wealthy textile manufacturers. He got them to give money to this charity and to that charity. The only group that didn't like the rabbi was the Bund. The Bund, as I'm going to mention, began to grow in Łódź after the turn of the 20th century. They were atheistic, they were Marxist. Not only did the rabbi preach fiery sermons against the Bund, but the Bundists suspected that he was conniving with Russian government officials to get Bundists sent to jail and sent to Siberia. As the city grew, the social gaps, the gaps in wealth became enormous. And most of the Jewish workers lived in a suburb of the city called Balut. And Balut only became part of Lodz in 1915, and this would be the site of the future ghetto. Balut had no sewers. It didn't have electricity until the late 1920s. It was mostly wooden buildings. It was a terrible slum. And as I said before, the Jewish workers were not working in the big factories. They were working in tiny little sweatshops. Sometimes they were working for themselves at a loom. More often, they were working for some other Jew who had some looms in his place, and they would work for him. And their position was miserable. Not only was it miserable, but it got steadily worse because of ongoing mechanization. The pressure to lower wages got worse and worse. So the average wage of a Jewish handloom weaver went from about 8 rubles a week to about 4 rubles a week, which was the equivalent of a couple of dollars. If you've read the Brothers Ashkenazi, you get a sense of what it was like to work in those shops. It was very patriarchal. In many of those shops, you needed a kvittel from either the Gera Rebbe or from the Alexandera Rebbe. Most of the Jewish workers coming into Łódź came from nearby shtetls, which were Hasidic shtetls, mainly Ger and Alexander, and you had to be a chassid to get your foot into the door. But once your foot was into the door, it was no great mitzvah. It was no big bargain. I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that the working hours sometimes lasted from 6 a.m. in the morning until 10 p.m. at night, with breaks for Shacharis and for Mincha Ma'ariv. The workers often had to work all night on Thursday to make up for the fact that they would take off early the following day. In the winter, when Shabbat ended early, they would have to go in about 6 p.m. on Saturday night and work until midnight. And their conditions kept deteriorating. And little by little, these workers who had been very religious began to get into fights and conflicts with their religious bosses. They began to make scenes in the synagogue. They began to interrupt the reading of the Torah. These were traditional ways of protesting injustice and exploitation. But by 1905, more and more workers were becoming politicized, they were becoming radicalized, and they were joining the Jewish Labor Bund. You'll recall from the first lecture of this series, I said that the Bund was born in Vilna. The Bund was a Litvak invention, but the Bund spread into the central Polish cities, Warsaw and Łódź, where it became especially powerful. And it was at this time that the Bund began to crystallize. It had its first martyr in Hirschke Lecker, that Vilna shoemaker that I told you about. And it also acquired its anthem, Die Shavua. And I want to play you just a little bit of the Shavua, because this remained the anthem of the Bund. It's we swear on our blood that we will fight for a better world. Brothers and sisters of labor and toil, all of you who are so oppressed, let us all come together. Okay. Himmel und Erd werden nun suis Herren, unser Redes soll sein die lichtige Stern. Heaven and earth will hear us. The stars up in the sky will be our witnesses. We will fight for Yosher. We will fight for justice. One of the great things about the Brothers Ashkenazi is that it describes this kind of seamless morphing of this traditional Jewish religious emphasis on justice and how it morphed into this radical socialist struggle, which led in 1905 to open battles in the streets between the Jewish workers and the Cossacks. And I'd be glad to talk about this during the question and answer. As Lodz prospered, it developed a bigger and bigger middle class. Many of these middle class Jews did not speak Yiddish. They were Polish speakers. Here you see the young pianist Artur Rubinstein. And here you see Julian Tuwim, one of the greatest Polish poets of the 20th century. Polish anti-Semites and Polish nationalists could not get over the fact that here was a Jew who wrote such beautiful Polish. And they kept on referring to him not as a Polish poet, but as a Polish language poet, meaning they refused to give him the title of a Pole. And Tuwim, his whole life, was tortured by the fact that he loved Polish culture, he loved the Polish language, but he knew that so many Poles looked at him as an outsider. Now, Tuwim took this perverse pride in the ugliness of his native city. He once wrote this poem, Niech sobie ganże Sorrento Krym podniemo inni wynoszą, ja łódź wolę jej brudy dym szczęście mi są I rozkosza, which means let other poets sing praises of the Ganges, of Sorrento, of the Crimea. Give me Łódź, her dirt and smoke. Her dirt and smoke are happiness and joy to me. It was kind of like in your face. You think Łódź is an ugly city? Well, deal with it. And of course, here is the monument today to Tuwim on Łódź's main street. In 1924, Tuwim wrote an unforgettable poem called The Żydek, or The Little Kike. And it's about this great poet looking from his first floor window, and he sees a dirty, pathetic Jewish beggar singing a little song and hoping that people will toss coins out from their windows. And this is a poem about how the famous poet identifies with the pathetic beggar because they're both Jews. And it ends, and we will both go our way, a path sad and crazed, and we will never find peace or rest. Singing Jews we are, we're lost Jews. I pójdziemy potem każdy w swą stronę na wędrówki nasze smutne I szalone, nie znajdziemy nigdy ciszy I przystani, Żydzi śpiewający, Żydzi obłąkani. During World War II, Tuwim was in Brazil, and in the war, he wrote an amazing poem, amazing for him because he was always a little conflicted about his Jewish identity, but as he heard of the Holocaust, he wrote this amazing poem called We Polish Jews. He returned to communist Poland after the war. And as I said, he's one of Poland's greatest poets. World War I brought the good times to an end. And you might say that the good times never came back. World War I devastated Łódź, not physically, but once the Germans occupied the city, they dismantled much of the factory equipment. And then after Poland regained its independence, Łódź was cut off from its traditional Russian markets. Now part of the new Soviet Union. So the Poznański factory eventually went bankrupt. Many of these factories went bankrupt. The Great Depression did not help. Rising anti-Semitism did not help. But while the boom times were gone, the Lodz textile industry survived. It survived by Jews finding niches, by Jews concentrating in specialized products. You might say that the Jewish working class of Łódź became more skilled and more resourceful. Łódź also became, during this period, a great center of Yiddish and Hebrew culture. This is the great Hebrew poet, Yitzhak Katz Nelson, who ran the very important Hebrew high school in Łódź. He's with his two sons. He and one son were killed in Auschwitz. His wife and another son were killed in Treblinka. His song that he wrote in Yiddish, just before he was sent to Auschwitz, Das Lied von ausgehargerten jüdischen Volk, the song of the murdered Jewish people, is a poem that I really believe that everybody should read. It's in an English translation. Lodz in the interwar period also became a center of a form of Yiddish theater called Kleinkunst, that is a mixture of cabaret and review and light theater. And the most important theater here was the Ararat, led by Moshe Brotherson. And the Kleinkunst was part of a movement in Lodz called Jung Yiddish, Young Yiddish. And it brought together writers like Moshe Brotherson, it brought together poets, it brought together artists who designed book covers. I'm thinking of Yankel Adler. And this became a very, very prominent center of the Yiddish arts and Yiddish culture. Jigan and Schumacher began their careers in Łódź before they moved to Warsaw. So here are some posters. Here's a book design of one of Moshe Brotherson's books, Die Malka Sheva. Here's another book design, Sichos Chulin. And finally, not finally, but Łódź was also the place where the famous Jewish strongman of Poland, Zisha Breitbart, used to perform. Zisha Breitbart would bend iron bars, and he would take a steel bit in his teeth and pull a heavy load with his teeth. And he was one of the wonders of Jewish Poland. Unfortunately, he died of a tetanus infection when a nail pierced his leg. And now we come to the Holocaust. When the German invasion began, there were 200,000 Jews in Łódź. And the city fell to the Germans in 6 days. About 50,000 Jews left the city. Almost the entire leadership left the city, but Chaim Rumkowski, and here you see Chaim Rumkowski, stayed, and he became the boss of the Jewish ghetto in Lodz. Rumkowski was a Litvak. He was born in 1877. He was energetic. I could only think of Yiddish words to describe him. He was a macher, he was a kochleffel, he made a few fortunes, he lost a few fortunes, he was on this board and he was on that board, he was always trying to push his way to the top. He saw himself as a big community activist. He never had any children of his own, and so before the war, he assumed a new role as the great protector of Jewish orphans. And he became the manager of one of the biggest Jewish orphanages in Poland at Helenówek. He corresponded with the famous pedagogue Janusz Korczak. He published a newspaper called Der Yosim, or The Orphan, and he received a lot of kudos for the work that he did with these unfortunate kids, although there were also many nasty rumors, unsubstantiated, that he was involved in improprieties with some of the older girls in the orphanage. After the Germans took the city on September 6th, the German population of Łódź, which had been on pretty good terms with the Jews, suddenly turned into vicious enemies. The Germans in Łódź knew the Jews. They knew who was rich. They knew who had money. They knew which stores were worth looting. And within a week, they gave the Gestapo all the information that they needed. And any wealthy Jew who thought that he could hide his money or hide his fortune would be summoned to German criminal headquarters, where he would be tortured until he revealed where he'd hidden his family valuables. The policeman who supervised the torture after World War II became head of the German Criminological Association. The first Jewish council was led by Rumkowski, and there were about 25 members of it, but no sooner was it formed than in November 1939, 20 members of the Jewish Council were murdered. The Germans also swooped down on the Cafe Astoria, where Yiddish writers would congregate, and they killed all of them. And then in a 4-day period, in around November 11th, they burned 4 of the biggest synagogues in the city. And as they were doing this, they annexed the whole city to the German Reich. Now, this was a very, very important point, that during World War II, Łódź would not be part of the general government. It would not be part of occupied Poland. It was part of the Reich. The Poles either had to sign the Volksliste saying that they accepted German nationality, or they had to leave the city, which meant that the Łódź ghetto, when it was formed in early 1940, was a hermetically closed ghetto. There was no Aryan side. In Warsaw, there was an Aryan side. On the other side of the wall, there was a Polish population. The Jews knew the Poles didn't love them, but they also hated the Germans. You could deal with them. You could smuggle food. Up to 90% of the calories in the Warsaw ghetto were smuggled in. The Łódź ghetto, no, not one bit of food was smuggled in after a certain point. The ghetto was tightly sealed. All the food that Jews in Lodz ate depended on German allocations. And the person who supervised those allocations, at least until 1943, was Rumkowski. That gave him a great deal of power. But remember, during the entire war, not one gun was smuggled into the Lodz ghetto. Not one emissary from the outside was able to get into the ghetto. And that explains, in part, why there was no armed resistance. Now, Rumkowski prided himself on being smarter than everybody else, on knowing what was what, on being tough, on being practical, on having seichel, and he saw himself as a messiah who was going to take these undisciplined, chaotic, lazy, sloppy Jews by the neck, and he was going to force them to work and to be productive and save their lives. And Rumkowski teamed up with this very slick German coffee merchant called Hans Bieboff. Hans Bieboff was not a Nazi until 1937. He didn't seem to be interested in politics at all. He was part of the new Litzmannstadt, the German name, city administration. And Rumkowski pitched the idea that Łódź, with its Jewish working class, with its skilled labor, could become a major source of production for the German war economy. Uniforms, caps, boots. Germany was starved for consumer goods. The Wehrmacht needed uniforms. Bieboff listened, and Bieboff went to his superiors, and then Bieboff traveled throughout the entire German Reich, talking to the Navy, talking to the Wehrmacht, talking to German department store owners, and getting orders for the factories that Rumkowski wanted to set up. And the Germans very graciously and magnanimously loaned Rumkowski money that they'd stolen from the Jews at 4.5% interest to set up machines and to set up factories. Now, Bebov turned into a monster. At first, he was very polite, but by 1942, he was helping to deport children to the Chelmno death camp. By 1944, he once beat up Rumkowski and sent him to the hospital. He raped a Jewish girl and then shot her through the head, but that all lay in the future. For the time being, they both worked together, and Lodz became a major center of production for the German war economy. By 1943, the ghetto had 117 different workshops, and they produced a significant percentage of the Wehrmacht's need for uniforms and for boots. And that explains why the Lodz ghetto lasted for so long. It lasted until August 1944, because whenever the SS wanted to liquidate the ghetto, Bebov would go to his boss, Arthur Greiser, a big Nazi who was making tons of money off the ghetto, and they would go to Albert Speer, the German armaments director, and Speer would go right to Hitler, and the Lodz ghetto would be allowed to survive for a little bit more. But that was only if you were able to work, because the deportations of those unable to work began in January 1942. And in the course of 1942, 71,000 inhabitants of the Lodz ghetto were deported to the gas vans of Chelmno. Over the course of the ghetto's existence, about 43,000 Jews died of starvation and hunger. And when the end of the ghetto came, about 70,000 Jews were left, and they were deported to Auschwitz. Now, as I said, Rumkowski saw himself as a messiah. He fancied himself as a guardian of the Jews. He liked to be photographed with children. Here's Rumkowski talking to various Germans. Rumkowski set himself up as a Mesader Kedushin. He presided over Jewish weddings. You had to have Rumkowski's permission before you got married. Rumkowski designed postage stamps for the ghetto mail with his own picture on it. This is a stamp. He had artists in the ghetto paint pictures of Rumkowski watching over these Jews who were looking at him pleadingly and hopefully. Chaim, will you save us? Power went to his head. He actually became younger in the ghetto. He was 63 when the war started. He married a woman 30 years younger, and everybody said that with every day, he looked better and better. He was very high-handed. He would not hesitate to hit you, to slap you in the face. If you got on his wrong side, he might put you on a list for deportation. On the other side of the ledger, he really tried to help children. He set up a very good system of ghetto schools. He tried to give them he tried to give the kids more food. And again, because food was only allocated and not smuggled in, as long as the Germans allowed him to, Rumkowski controlled the distribution of food. Rumkowski was a Jewish nationalist. He decreed that in the ghetto schools, the languages would be Yiddish and Hebrew, no Polish, and teachers who couldn't teach in Yiddish had to go to special courses. He encouraged Zionist youth to start up little farms in the Marishin region where there was open land, although he shut them down very quickly when they began to criticize him. In October 1941, the schools had to shut down because the Germans dumped 20,000 German and Czech Jews into the ghetto. And the children were now ordered by Rumkowski to start learning useful trades so they could work in factories and not be liable to deportations. A terrible nightmare, a terrible trauma began on September 5th, 1942. Like a bolt from the blue, the Germans suddenly demanded that Rumkowski deport all children under the age of 10 and all adults over the age of 65. The quota was 20,000. And since the children and parents of ghetto bigwigs and ghetto supervisors were exempt, that meant that the quota would be short and they would have to take people from other categories. The Germans proclaimed what they called a Gehsperre, a total lockdown. For 7 days, no Jew was allowed to leave his apartment. And the Germans and the Jewish police went from apartment to apartment with lists of who lived where. Every child under the age of 10 would be snatched from their parents' arms and taken away. Rumkowski gave an unforgettable speech, and I want to quote just a little bit of it. A terrible blow has befallen the ghetto. They are demanding from us the most precious thing we have, the children and the elderly. I never was worthy of having a child of my own, so I dedicated the best years of my life to the children. I never imagined that I would have to deliver this sacrifice to the altar. In my old age, I must stretch out my arms to you and cry, fathers and mothers, give me your children. I must cut off limbs in order to save the body. I must hand over the children, and if not, the Germans will take more people. If we hand over the victims ourselves, it will be better. You could imagine what happened. You were locked up in your apartment and you heard them come closer and closer. You were in an absolute trap. You couldn't go outside. If you had an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old, you knew that in half an hour, in 2 hours, tomorrow, they would come and they would take the 7-year-old. And there was nothing you could do about it. Some parents committed suicide. It was horrible. The kids thought that they were going on a horsey ride, and they were laughing. There were two ghetto photographers, Mendel Grossman and Henrik Ross, who surreptitiously took pictures of the little children being put on carts and taken away to Chelmno to be killed. And here we see some of these pictures. Here we see a picture of Bibov looking on. Here we see a picture of Bibov and Rumkowski. Bibov. So here are the Germans who supervised the deportation. Notice these are middle-aged men. These are not young men who were soldiers. Again, kids being taken into the cattle cars. Notice some of the caregivers, some of the teachers who volunteered to go with the children, knowing that they're going to be killed. Adam Chernyakov in the Warsaw Ghetto, when he realized that the Germans were asking him to be complicit in the murder of his own people, and especially in the murder of Jewish children, he committed suicide. Rumkowski decided that there was no choice but to hand over kids in order to save as many people as he could and play for time. And you have to grudgingly admit that Rumkowski wheeled and dealed and gained time. The Lodz ghetto hung on until August 1944, when the Russians were only 60 miles away. And that's when Bibov said, you're all going to be evacuated from the German Reich. The German Reich needs workers. And of course, all those trains in August 1944 went to Auschwitz. 70,000 Lodz Jews were taken to Auschwitz. About 50,000 were selected for the gas chambers, and about 20,000 were selected for labor. Because it was so late in the war, there were about 7,000 survivors from the Lodz ghetto, and that's more than survived from any other ghetto. The example of Chaim Rumkowski shows us how terribly difficult it is to make any moral judgments, because it's very easy for us to sit here and say, well, Rumkowski was a monster, or Rumkowski was a terrible person. There were many survivors from the Lodz ghetto who said that we would have lynched him had he survived the war. Rumkowski, who, as you know, was killed in Auschwitz in the gas chambers, kept saying, after the war, I will gladly present myself to a Jewish court of honor. I did the best that I could. But keep this in mind, and this is something which just reminds us how infernally difficult these moral judgments are. The liquidation of the Lodz ghetto began on August 1st, 1944. 10 days before, on July 20th, 1944, a German colonel, Klaus von Stauffenberg, put a bomb in Hitler's underground bunker in East Prussia. The bomb exploded and almost killed the Fuhrer. Had a German officer not moved the briefcase to another side of a thick oak table, Hitler would have been killed. Had Hitler been killed, there's no question that the Jews in the Lodz ghetto would have survived. 70,000 Jews would have been alive. And then the question is, what would they have thought of Rumkowski, and what would we think of Rumkowski? Be that as it may, the Lodz ghetto was the last ghetto. Because so many Jews survived, we know more about what happened in that ghetto than any other. The very rich Lodz ghetto archive survived, German documents survived, and we marvel at the very rich cultural life of the Jews in the ghetto, the writers, the poets who worked in the ghetto, the artists. If I had time for another lecture, I would talk about that. But I guess at this point, we can adjourn for questions. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sam. And I think what we'll do, you've given us so much material to think about, and also a few suggestions for questions for us to discuss in the Q&A portion. So if you want, why don't we take just a short 2-minute break? If people need to get up, walk around, whatever, get a drink of water. And while we're taking the break, use the time to type some questions into the chat for Sam, and we'll reconvene in about 2 minutes and start to answer those questions. Thank you. Okay, Sam, if you're ready, we have our first question has come in, um, which asks specifically, well, about to go back to the brothers Ashkenazi. So, do you know if Israel Joshua Singer, did he live in Lodz, and sort of what did he base his material for this novel on?
No, he didn't. He didn't live in Lodz. He lived in Warsaw, but he spent a lot of time in Lodz. And he, I mean, he knew, as most Jews knew, they knew the saga of the Poznanskis. They also, of course, learned quite a lot from just talking to uh, some of the Warsaw families that knew these Lodz families. They were related. They married between themselves. But what's amazing about the brothers Ashkenazi is when you think of the history, when you think of all the history that's being presented, it's absolutely 100% accurate. Now, it's a novel, but yet every historical fact that's presented is real. Now, the characters are fictional, but of course, they're based on some real people. The novel was written in the mid 1930s, and it was incredibly prescient. And it was, I don't want to spoil it I because people might want to read it, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but the novel never ceases to amaze me. It's so rich, and I can't think of any other novel where you might say the main plot line is the story of a city.
There's a lot of questions coming in. It's interesting about the Singer brothers because there is this idea with Yod Singer, the older brother, that it, he dies in 1944, if I'm not mistaken, and it's not
Right.
until he dies that the little brother can sort of emerge from his shadow and become the Nobel Prize winning Yitzhak Bashevis Singer. I don't know if you give that credence, that sort of theory of him emerging from that shadow, or it's just a matter of,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, Bashevis was the little brother. He was the little pipsqueak. Bashevis was not regarded as a major writer, and he would not be regarded as a major writer for a very long time. Although, when you look back, you see that when Bashevis wrote Satan in Garai, that's a strikingly original work. When Bashevis is collaborating with Aaron Seitlin in a periodical called Globus in the 30s, he's way ahead of his time. The Family Muscat, which he writes after World War II, is an amazing novel. So it's that Bashevis was uh, his his talents were a little bit premature for the audience.
Interesting. All right, let me get to some of the, a lot of good questions coming in. So um, Gary and Eva asks about future lectures. We'll come to that at the end. But Gary Starr asks about the Cossack attacks that you mentioned in 1905. Can you tell us a little bit more the context about that? Gary asks, was it related to the Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War? So what was happening in 1905 in those attacks?
Yeah, there was a revolution all over Russia, and it was especially intense in Warsaw and in Lodz, where the Bund and the Polish Socialist Party manned barricades together, and they fought pitched battles against the Cossacks. And this revolution was strengthened by a general strike in October 1905, which in turn resulted, one, in the proclamation of a semi-constitution, and two, in the breaking out of hundreds of pogroms, where some thousands of Jews were killed. But you might say that the fighting in 1905 became part of the glorious self-referential traditions of the Jewish Labor Bund.
Interesting. So I don't know if this is from David or Anne Brandwine, but I'll just ask in both their names. You mentioned a German officer who tortured prosperous Jews to reveal where their wealth was hidden, and who after the war became part of the German criminal court. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened to him? Was he ever tried for war crimes? What was sort of the process of denazification of any, or just was this a whitewashing?
No, he prospered. He did just fine. I talk about this in my article in the New Republic. He became I think, if I'm not mistaken, a professor. He became the editor of the German Journal of Criminology. You'll be glad to know that he was not prosecuted because in German law he committed no crime. He was part of the Kripo, or the Kriminalpolizei. There was a law that Jews had to turn over all their property for the Treuhand, i.e. to be declared and Aryanized, and he was simply following the law. He was getting information about property that should have been transmitted to the Reich and was not, and he was perfectly in his rights to do his job. And God forbid that you should even question this fine, upstanding individual.
Yeah, it wasn't against the law.
It wasn't against the law.
Right. Disregarding any moral, ethical code. There's a question here. The next question comes from Janice Hoff, who asks, when did Jews begin emigrating from Lodz? And she writes, my paternal great-grandparents left just after 1900. And if I can expand that question a little bit more, it's interesting you talk about the industrial history of a city like Lodz, which is going to be very much hit by, economic transformations that are taking place and depressions. And do you see more Jews emigrating from Lodz than from other cities? Can you trace that as part of the history of migration to different places?
Well, I mean, the big migration begins in the 1880s for a number of reasons. As I said, the Jewish population is increasing so quickly that the safety nets are unable to keep people going. While many people say the reason their ancestors migrated was because of pogroms, the real reason was economic desperation. But the very, very, very poorest people could not emigrate for a number of reasons. One, because a ship's ticket or a ship's cart at the cheapest cost about $25 or about 100 rubles, which the very poorest people couldn't afford. And men had to pay a smuggler, because otherwise, if they wanted to leave legally, they had to show they did their military service in the Tsar's army. So the people who emigrated were not the middle class, because they had no reason to emigrate. The upper class usually didn't emigrate. The rabbis said, don't go to America because it's the Treffen and Medina. The very poor didn't immigrate. It was people that had just enough, so that very often one person would emigrate, make a little money, and then start sending for the rest of the family one by one. Then the more people who did emigrate, then you began to get a critical mass, and there was a base to go to, and you have the Landsmannschaften that could welcome migrants from a certain town, from a certain city. Now, when 1905 happened, you had this wave of pogroms, especially in October. One pogrom in Odessa alone killed about 500 Jews. After 1905, the character of the emigration changed. Then you began to get intellectuals, you began to get middle-class Jews leaving, seeing no future in Russia. But the very poorest classes had a very hard time. By the way, one of the, there are many illustrious migrants from Lodz, but one was David Dubinsky, who came to the United States as a young man and became the leader of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and one of the leaders of the Jewish labor movement in the United States. He was a Bundist in Lodz.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about this sort of industrial tradition and the development of working class consciousness, and then Poznański's role in trying to prevent that development. I wonder about the geography, because it's interesting in the classes you've traced sort of a story that goes from east to west in the case of going from Vilna to Warsaw to Lodz. And how does that affect sort of the identity of a city like Lodz, which does become, during the war, part of it's much closer to Germany. It's much more affected by sort of what happens both in World War I and World War II by its proximity to Germany. I mean, how does this proximity to Germany affect the sort of development of the city differently from, let's say, Vilna and its sort of geography further to the east?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there was a big German population, even in and the Germans were a significant part of the Lodz middle class. After World War II, they were kicked out by the Poles. And by the way, because Lodz was not really harmed during the war, the Poles didn't fight for it in 1939. And when the Russians attacked in January 1945, the attack was so quick that the Germans didn't have time to destroy the city. The city physically was largely intact. And because Warsaw had been totally destroyed after World War II, many Jews, surviving Jews, went to Lodz. The Germans had been kicked out. There were apartments that could be lived in. And there was a Jewish community in Lodz for a time. For a time, Lodz was kind of the center of Jewish life in Poland, 46, 47. But after the Kielce pogrom, most of the Polish Jews skedaddled across the border into the displaced persons camps of West Germany.
I'm gonna combine a couple of questions here. That one that comes from Marty that asks, is there a Jewish community today in Lodz similar to Krakow or Warsaw? And the second one that I'll combine with that is a question that comes from Joan, which is about sort of the tourism of the present day, because Joan asks about, with this history of the history that you described today of what happens during the war, and then the post-war history of Polish anti-Semitism, destruction of the shtetls, why are Jews today, she asks, paying Polish guides to sort of take them back to the old homes that have been occupied and not returned, I think. So can you tell us just a little bit about the present day kind of tourism, both in Lodz and then more generally? Yeah.
Look, Lodz is a city that is down on its luck. Warsaw and Krakow are booming cities. Warsaw is a booming city. Krakow is a beautiful city. They both have Jewish communities. There's a Hillel in Warsaw and in Krakow. And Lisa, by the way, was instrumental in helping to organize the Hillel in Warsaw. There are JCCs in Warsaw and Krakow. There's not only a beautiful shul in Warsaw, but there's a breakaway from the shul, which is a good sign that there is a Jewish community, because there's a shul that I won't set foot in. The optimism, the cautious optimism that people like myself had, back in 2010, 2011, that Jewish life was slowly reviving in Poland. I'm less optimistic now. This present government is really terrible. In Lodz, there's a tiny Jewish community. There are prayers. There's a venue. but it's nowhere near the scale of Warsaw and Krakow. You know, if you want to get rich in real estate and you're willing to take a flyer, buy property in Lodz because it's so cheap that it might be the next real estate boom. The city is, you know, as I said, you know, what do you say about an American city that used to be based on textile factories? You know, you could say Azoch and Ve, you know, clearly it's not a city that's doing very well now. All the Lodz factories have closed down. And it's kind of like Lowell, Mass. They've turned the Poznansky factory into a big tourist center, very nicely done with good restaurants and very tasteful museums. The
Or North
Poznansky Palace,
Adams.
what?
Or North Adams,
Yeah,
Massachusetts.
right, or
With the
North
museum.
Adams.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they're trying to repackage Lodz as a tourist center. Lodz has the best film school in Poland, though the great film directors like Andrzej Wajda studied in Lodz. Lodz is trying to reinvent itself. Uh, and little by little, it's coming back. And because real estate is so expensive now in Warsaw and in Krakow, some people are saying if you buy these buildings for nothing in the Lodz, in 10 years, you'll be a millionaire.
Yeah, you just have to, if you come from there, it means you have to buy back the property that your family maybe once owned, right?
Absolutely.
And reacquire it. There is okay, so a couple more questions.
Now, just the thing about the Polish guides. I work with a lot of Polish guides. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Poland, and there are many, many Polish young people who are wonderful, really wonderful. And I have so much respect for them. And, you know, sometimes there's like a blue Poland and a red Poland. Like in the last elections in places like Warsaw, 60% of the people voted against the present government. There's you can't generalize about quote unquote the Poles. There are many, many really terrific people in Poland today.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So to think about it, because there is a really also strong urban-rural divide, right? You have these big cities, and then it doesn't take long to get out of these big cities and to really sort of travel back in time.
The Catholic Church. And when you go into the cities, the church, especially now with this abortion stuff, and Polish women have been leading these huge demonstrations against the government with a slogan which I won't repeat here, but which is pretty graphic.
So I'm going to ask a question that came in from, I think, from Renana, which is interesting. You talked about this Poznansky dynasty, right? And sort of and so Renana asks, what happens to the family of Poznansky? What happens to his descendants?
There were many descendants. There was a grandson who was a pilot in the French Air Force and was killed in action. Many descendants ended up in France, some in Great Britain. The family lost its money. And so none of these descendants were very well heeled.
The French historian of French Jewish life, Renee Poznansky, is she a descendant of this family? Do you know?
I know Renee very well. I asked her once, she said no. But but the rabbi of the Klamatsky synagogue who succeeded Isaac Silko, his name was Samuel Poznansky, and he I think was a relative.
Yeah. There's a question here. This must be from my father, or a comment that he says that. So this would be my father's uncle. He mentions that he was a Turkish citizen. So this is to the period of the war. So Jews thought that their money was safe with him. He was turned into the Germans, and his house was torn down in search of treasures. And so maybe this is, we haven't talked about sort of the fate of Lodz Jewry during the war, and as you described, this sort of choiceless choices that somebody like Rumkowski had to make. But maybe tell us just a little bit more about the view of the ghetto population, of that surviving population of Rumkowski, because it is a very difficult legacy of sort of the choices that he makes to turn it into a productive ghetto of workers, right? That, how do you think the ghetto population views him right up until the summer of 44?
That's a tough question. I mean, you know, today there are no survivors left from the Lodz ghetto. They've all passed on. But, you know, I remember back in the day in Hartford, you had Fred Jacobs, you had George Scheinfarber. There were a lot of Ludzers who settled in Connecticut. I think Weinstein, the baker in New Haven, Lucian Dobrashitsky, who was at the YIVO, Tursky, who's still alive, one of the last survivors of the Lodz ghetto, who's in Warsaw and is with the Jewish Historical Institute. And some people hated him. Some people hated him, detested him. And people would get very angry at me when, as a historian, I went into, on the one hand, on the other hand kind of shtick. And they said, no, he was a monster. And I neglected to mention that there were some women who testified that he used his power to get sexual favors in 42 and 43. On the other hand, there were survivors who said he did the best he could. He was not an attractive person. He was not the kind of person that you would like, but he felt that he was doing the best that he could for the Jewish population. So the opinions are very, very polarized. And he himself died in a gas chamber.
Right. So I want to take a moment before we wrap up, and somebody writes in here that about the experience of deportation to Russia and then return to Warsaw and then to Lodz, and then Ida writes in here about sort of trying to return to Poland, the rebirth or the attempt to rebuild Jewish communities in Poland, and then Jews who leave when, you know, there's actually, even before Kielce, there's anti-Jewish violence that's taking place in 45 and then 46. So she writes about this. But I want to take a moment just before we run out of time for the class to do sort of an overview of what you've just accomplished, which is to provide us with, you know, sort of a tour of Jewish Eastern Europe from Vilna to Warsaw to Lodz over the course of the 5 sessions, that for the most part, aside from, you know, tonight's class, which you took us into the Lodz ghetto and the difficulties of the, you know, history of what Rumkowski did in the Lodz ghetto, but you focused for the most part on pre-war Jewish life, on the life before. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on sort of the distinctive nature of this civilization and why it's so important for you to make sure that, you know, students, classes know about what life was like before the war and the differences between these Jewish communities. Why you wanted to focus so much on teaching about life before the war as opposed to talking about what happens during the war.
I think there are a lot of reasons. I mean, there are personal reasons. You know, that my parents grew up in pre-war Poland, and by the way, they were in Lodz until September 46, when 2 weeks before I was born, they left Lodz, my mother being very pregnant, and walked across the Czech border. There's also the fact that not only is this very vibrant, creative world of Polish Jewry worth remembering, but I think it also holds very important lessons for Jews going forward. because in the Jewish world today, as we look around at our Jewish world, we really see two centers of the Jewish people today. We see Israel, which is a model of Jewishness based on political sovereignty, a state that is powerful and that, thank God, is able to defend Jews from external threats. On the other hand, we see America, where the Jewish identity in America is kind of like a Chinese menu. It's really all up to the individual. You pick and you choose. You tailor it to what you want. It's your individual choice, your individual whim, deciding how you'll calibrate that proportion between your individual needs and your Jewish loyalties. And what Polish Jewry signifies to me is the great in-between that's missing, the great donut hole. That is a community of millions of Jews of all social classes, of all political persuasions, mostly speaking Yiddish, but many speaking Polish, but who felt a great sense of Jewish peoplehood, who felt part of the Jewish people, who were very interested in Jewish history, who were very interested in studying not only the Jewish past, but the Jewish present. Young kids joining youth movements. Now, you might argue that some of that intellectual creativity was a result of persecution, poverty, and anti-Semitism that had the Poles open their arms and said, join us, maybe many Jews would have become less, quote unquote, Jewish. But to me, we have a lot to learn by really studying the experience of Polish Jewry before the war, because that offers a model of Jewish loyalty, which I think we really need going forward, and which is really missing.
Well, Sam, I want to thank you. That's a sort of a perfect way to sum up the class and for us to think about the experience of learning with you over these last 5 sessions. So I think all of us, maybe we'll do our sort of virtual round of applause. And thank you for an incredible series, and thank you for taking us on this tour of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. There was a question in the beginning from Eva about will there be future classes? So we don't have any specific plans, but yes, there will be future classes. We will organize a follow-up because this has been such a successful series, and I'd love for us to do something. If you're up for it, Sam, we'll do something again in the future, because I think we have a ready-made population that would love to continue to learn with you. So thank you again. It's been wonderful to learn from you over these last few weeks. And thank you to all of you who have been students in this series and in this class. It's been wonderful to see you all virtually. It's still going to be much better to gather at the community services building and sit around the table and have some time to nosh and schmooze, but we'll get there soon. So in the meantime, everybody stay healthy, stay safe, get your vaccines, and maybe I'll see you at the film festival. For those who are interested, we have a post-film discussion tomorrow night, the beginning of the Hartford Jewish Film Festival, a discussion of Holy Silence. It's on the website hjff.org. You can check it out. There's great films coming up this month, so hopefully we'll see you at some of those programs. But thank you again to all of you for being here, and thank you, Sam, for a wonderful series. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.